So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another one of the summer CERIAS security seminars. It's my pleasure to introduce Neil Daswani to speak to us today. He is returning as a speaker in the seminar series, having last spoken in October of 2007 when he was at Google. Really, we should have invited him back much sooner than this. But this is in conjunction with the recent publication of his book, Big Breaches, Cybersecurity Lessons for Everyone. You see part of the, you at least see the title on the screen. A fascinating book that I've been reading through myself, and I can recommend it as I was saying earlier, as a set of both enlightening and horrifying stories. So we're going to let Neil tell us more about Big Breaches. If you have questions for him, please put them in the Q&A, and when he's done talking, we'll address some of those. So without further ado, a distinguished practitioner who's got an extensive career working in security. His bio is partly online with the talk, so I'm not going to spend time on it, but let me just say we're extraordinarily pleased to have Neil back with us. Neil, please take it away.
Great, thank you, Spaff. I am extremely honored and privileged to be presenting here at CERIAS today. Like you mentioned, I gave a talk here years ago, back when I was an engineer at Google, and published my first book, Foundations of Security, What Every Programmer Needs to Know. But today I'm going to be talking about my second book, Big Breaches, Cybersecurity Lessons for Everyone. And let me just mention that I currently am a co-director of Stanford's Advanced Cybersecurity Program. I also do cybersecurity consulting and training on the side under Daswani Enterprises. Since my last visit here, I've been up to a lot. So when I presented last time, I was an engineer at Google. I went on to become a product manager at Google, and then left Google to start a company by the name of Dacian that Google Ventures funded. We were in the business of detecting malicious ads that cyber criminals were uploading. And we got acquired by Twitter about a year prior to their IPO. After spending some time at Twitter and leaving Twitter, I have also spent some time as a chief information security officer for both LifeLock, which is one of the leading identity protection providers in the United States. And I've also served as a chief information security officer at Symantec's consumer business unit. After spending some time as a CISO, I've also spent some time in investor land. I served as an executive in residence at Trinity Ventures, and continue to co-direct the Stanford Advanced Security Program together with Dan Bonet and John Mitchell at Stanford. Absolute privilege working together with both of them. I have been spending a lot more time as an advisor. I'm a limited partner in a bunch of funds, and one of the reasons that I co-authored this book together with Muti Albayati is because I wanted to get an understanding not only of, well, where has the $45 billion of cybersecurity funding, both private equity and public IPO funding, gone over the past 15 years, but what have they funded? What have been the root causes of breaches? And how are we doing with regards to addressing the root causes of breaches? And why is the world the way it currently is, with still, one big breach happening after the other? So I'm going to spend most of the time today talking about the histories and the stories of some of the biggest breaches that have taken place. I probably won't have time to get through all of them, but what I will do is I will sample them. And the first half of the book pretty much focuses on, the histories and stories and the key lessons to be learned from these big breaches. The second half of the book focuses on a roadmap to recovery, starting with what are the right habits that an organization should put in place to achieve security. And for those habits, we were in part inspired by Stephen Covey's habits for interpersonal skills and success and whatnot, but we came up with 7 such habits for security, and we draw upon decades of research that have already been done. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll also talk a little bit about the technology defenses that organizations can employ to specifically target the root causes of breach. One of the challenges in the field is that there's many security compliance standards. There's hundreds of checkboxes to check, but the question is, Should we just do the minimal work to check each checkbox, or is there a smaller set of, say, root causes that we should target and put strong, scientifically effective countermeasures in place for in order to address the overwhelming majority of things that could result in breaches? So let me start talking about some of the big breaches. And let me start by talking about just some stats from privacyrights.org. So privacyrights.org has cataloged over 9,000 reported breaches that have taken place ever since 2003, which was when California passed the first data breach notification law, and then many, many states followed. And they basically annotate each of these breaches with a cause. And so I've diagrammed out those clauses here in this histogram, and you can see that the biggest bar that they attribute is to hacking or malware. At the same time, there's some pretty significant bars here for breaches that are due to physical loss and that are due to portable devices. Now, one thing to keep in mind with regards to both physical loss of, say, media that might not be encrypted, or mobile phones or laptops that get stolen or lost and that might not be encrypted, those result in breaches because the data is not encrypted. If the data was encrypted, then there would not be a breach under the legal breach notification laws. You can have incidents, you can have compromises, you can have all kinds of things happen, but if you have encrypted the data and you keep that secret key safe, then all kinds of things can get stolen. So in any case, while it looks like our hacking or malware may be our biggest problem, I'd say that making sure to get all data encrypted is still a big problem. It's just kind of surprising that many, many decades after the advent of AES and DES and a whole bunch of other encryption standards, that the encryption is just simply not turned on everywhere that it perhaps needs to be. And then, of course, once data is encrypted, you can have, it does make sense to worry about third parties getting into one's systems, unauthorized third parties, of course. And we also have to keep in mind that when somebody's account gets phished or a password is used off the dark web, and shared passwords are used between different systems, effectively, once you have a valid credential, whatever systems that use that credential will happily decrypt data for you. So you need to worry about that as well in any case. So there's a bunch of different clauses here, but I wanted to highlight some of those clauses. In particular, on this slide, I list out a bunch of the big breaches and what were their root causes. I'm going to chat about this in a lot more detail, but this is a quick summary slide if you want to refer to it at a later point. I also have a couple slides here that just give a table of some of the big breaches on a per year basis, and summarize what got stolen in the breach and what type of data it was and what some of the impacts were. But let me go through some of the stories. And let me go back to the Target breach in 2013. The Target breach was interesting because it was the first mega breach after which both the CEO and the Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO, got fired. The board also got sued. It may have been the case that prior to this breach that a CISO or a head of IT might get fired if there's a breach. But what happened in this breach was, with over 40 million credit card numbers getting stolen, and I'll talk about how they got stolen, the accountability went up the chain to the CEO and up to the board. The way that this breach had occurred was that attackers initially got into one of Target's third parties. They broke into a company called Fazio Mechanical Services that was responsible for running the heating and air conditioning in all the Target retail stores. And they also did such work for many other retail chains as well. Target was not the only one, but the attackers basically were able to steal some network credentials from Fazio Mechanical Services and then use that to pivot into Target's network, because effectively the networks were not very well segmented or segmented at all. And so one was able to get in through the heating and air conditioning systems and then pivot and laterally move into eventually the point of sale stations, which attackers infected with malware. And what they did is, prior to Thanksgiving 2013, they started to exfiltrate small amounts of data. And when they saw it working, then they basically turned it on full stream. And that's when the attack got noticed. By the way, Target, you think the pretty big retail company, they've got to have had some defenses in place to say identify malware that was getting injected into their systems. And indeed, they did. They were a customer of FireEye and had spent over $1 million on FireEye equipment. The alerts from the FireEye equipment were getting escalated from a team in India to their team in the US. The problem was that there was enough noise and there were enough false positives that they had previously seen, combined together with the fact that the malware was given a very generic categorization, malware.binary, as opposed to something more specific. And so the results, the alerts were not acted on as aggressively as they could have. So that's a little bit about the target breach and some of the ways that it could have been prevented. Better network segmentation, enough staff to vet the malware alerts, and having malware alerts that had just a lower false positive rate would have helped. The overall impact was Target had to pay over $250 million in breach costs and suffers from some reputational damage at the time. The stock price did take a temporary hit and then came back. And today, Target runs one of the best kind of threat intelligence centers in organizations. So they've turned this around. That's not to say they couldn't get breached again, but that's a little bit about the Target breach. The very next year, JPMorgan Chase, one of the largest banks in the United States, got breached. What happened in that breach is that there were 70 million customer names and email addresses that got stolen. And you could imagine that for a bank, you could have a lot worse things happen, right? If attackers were able to break in and transfer money, that would have been much worse. Being a large bank, JPMorgan Chase was also spending over $250 million annually on their security program. And so one might ask the question, wow, that's a lot of money. How did they get breached? Well, they also got breached through a third party. They were using a third party web management company called Simco Data Systems that was running the website for their charitable marathon races. And what happened was the attackers were able to compromise one of those website certificates and start getting access to passwords that employees were using on that charitable marathon race website. Now, as we know, users often share passwords between systems when they shouldn't. And so there were a number of employees at JPMorgan Chase that were using the same password for the charitable marathon race website as they were for their corporate banking logins. And so, there are shared passwords in place, but one would expect that any bank of this size is also using two-factor authentication, such that even if a password got stolen, an attacker would have to beat the two-factor authentication as well. Well, JPMorgan Chase did have two-factor authentication in place almost across all their systems. There was one or a small number of servers that they had that did not have the two-factor authentication enabled. And so with the combination of some of the passwords getting compromised due to the website certificate getting compromised, and the attackers had visibility into the passwords, and the fact that there was just one server where they could log in using those stolen passwords without the 2FA, they were able to get in to some of the bank systems and then pivot, laterally move until they got to a database that had 70 million plus customer names and email addresses. Now, of course, you ask yourself, well, what's the risk there? Is it really, is the theft of customer names and email addresses really that bad? Well, for those of us that have been in the security field for quite some time, we know that the way that most phishing attacks used to happen was attackers used to blanket consumers with imposter emails claiming to be one bank or the other. They typically choose a large bank that many many consumers might be using, and hope that one of them clicks on the link in the email and goes and logs in the imposter website with their credentials. But if you're an attacker and you've stolen 70 million customer names and email addresses from a single bank, and you know that they're customers, it makes those customers much more susceptible to spear phishing attacks, much more targeted phishing attacks, because you know they have an account at the bank. Post this breach, JPMorgan Chase doubled their security budget to over 500 million, and went about using standards like DKIM and DMARC, such that it makes it harder for attackers to craft imposter emails. I think for a long time in the security field, we've been chasing the goal of end-to-end digitally signed and encrypted emails. And while that still eludes us as an industry, one is able to use standards like DKIM and DMARC to sign emails on behalf of an organization and put public keys in DNS entries such that any email client or any email client or any ISP can check as to whether or not the email might actually be coming from that organization. And it's great to see that JPMorgan Chase now has deployed DMARC with a 100% reject policy. So for those folks that are interested in anti-phishing defenses here, if you haven't previously heard of or are using DKIM and DMARC, I'd encourage checking them out. The next breach that I'll talk about is the Office of Personnel Management breach from 2015. What got stolen in this breach was over 20 million SF-86 background check records. So for those of you that have done work with the government and might be a government contractor or have gotten secret clearance, you probably had to fill out this SF-86 form, which asks you not only a whole bunch of sensitive information about yourself, including your social security number, but includes such information about your family members, friends, neighbors, as the vetting process to become an employee in a government organization is significant. And the Office of Personnel Management was pretty much serving as the chief HR organization for most government agencies, not including the CIA. But you could imagine that, let's say, if you're a foreign nation state adversary, let's say, the Chinese government, and you want to determine who are the CIA agents that might be in your country, what you could do is you could look at all the aliases and all the names that are on file with your State Department, and you could subtract out the set of names that were stolen from the OPM breach, and the much smaller list that's left is your set of candidate CIA agents. So this was such a significant breach that when Congress investigated it, a number of folks felt that it was a major counterintelligence setback. The impact could not be overstated, nor would it ever be known, and it would probably take at least a generation or two to be able to recover from this to this extent that one can recover from such things. How did the OPM get breached? Well, let me mention that the typical management failures that occur are the failure to prioritize cybersecurity, the failure to invest in cybersecurity, and the failure to execute on cybersecurity initiatives successfully. In the case of OPM, they were only investing $7 million annually into their cybersecurity program when even the Department of Agriculture was investing over 70 million. So that's a pretty significant underinvestment in security. In fact, when it came down to a tactical level, OPM did not have two-factor authentication deployed at all, and whatever anti-malware defenses might have been in place were completely insufficient. At the time that they were breached, it was identified that 1 out of every 5 machines at the OPM were infected. So using basic defenses. So once you decide to prioritize and invest, using basic defenses like multi-factor authentication, anti-malware, and also taking legacy systems and making sure that if they can't be patched or whatnot, that they're sectioned off, segmented, and that you put other defensive systems in place in front of them if you can't patch them or whatnot. It's just very important to do. It was surprising to me that in the aftermath of the OPM breach, they gave the government employees that were affected credit monitoring services for maybe a year or two, but that's a far cry from full identity theft protection that encompasses monitoring your assets as well as your credit instruments. And when a foreign nation state gets this kind of data, heck, they could use the stolen metadata about government employees to try to mint spies in the country and get them employed at government agencies. So the kind of defense that was kind of put out there with just basic credit monitoring, I think was pretty insufficient in my very humble opinion. In any case, let me talk about a couple other breaches. As if these breaches thus far weren't bad enough, the very next year, Yahoo announced that they had two breaches that actually occurred in 2013 and 2014, but they had disclosed them in 2016. What they had found is that in 2013 and 2014, they had various internal systems that got breached due to spear phishing and malware, in which attackers were able to steal 500 million and a billion accounts from their user database. But what was much worse is that once the four Russian hackers, two of which were ex-FSB agents, when they broke in, they reverse engineered Yahoo's cookie generation algorithm. And so for those of us that know how authentication, basic user and password authentication on the web works, you know that when you log into a website with a username and password, one of the cookies that you get back is what is an authentication cookie. Once your credentials have been checked, you're given this authentication cookie, and it's really the authentication cookie that then goes back and forth between the browser and the server that authenticates you. HTTP is a stateless protocol, and so if you don't want to have to keep on entering the username and password on every single page, it's that cookie that ends up authenticating you. But once the attackers were able to steal the source code that Yahoo used to generate their cookies, they were able to, at will, log into any of the over 3 billion Yahoo accounts, just knowing the email address. They didn't even need to know the password. This has been the largest breach in the history of the internet in terms of the number of accounts that were exposed to the breach. These breaches were disclosed while Yahoo was in the process of getting acquired by Verizon, and Verizon had initially agreed to acquire Yahoo for $4.8 million. That price was dropped by $350 million, in part to help deal with the breach costs. So that's the Yahoo breach in summary. And by the way, I know I'm giving kind of very high level summaries. There's of course a lot more details in the book around how each of these breaches occurred, including even delving into more technical details. But I think the goal of the talk here is to extract what are some of the high level themes. And so let me move on to the next breach from the very next year, 2017. In 2017, Equifax got breached in what was the largest financial identity breach in the United States. Approximately half the country had their credit records stolen. And I think it was pretty well known in the media that the way that this breach occurred, the way that the initial compromise occurred, was Equifax was running a unpatched Apache Struts server, and didn't patch that server in time, and it appears that there were some Chinese or Chinese funded attackers that broke in. I will say that there was a lot more that went wrong beyond just an Apache Struts server not being patched. So at the time that the patch was made available and released, Equifax did have a internal global threat and vulnerability management team that started scanning Equifax for such vulnerabilities. They also sent emails out to about 400 employees telling people to go ahead and patch the Apache Struts server. But there's a whole bunch of things that was wrong with the approach and the way things played out. So first of all, for any vulnerability management program at any significant organization, just sending out emails and expecting humans to, react to those emails and patch stuff is not what typically makes up what's called a closed loop workflow management around vulnerabilities that also includes technical verification. So most organizations that have a more sophisticated technical vulnerability management program will have a scanner generate a whole bunch of tickets in an automated way, and then allow maybe humans to do the patching and claim that they have patched the systems, but not let humans close out the tickets, saying that the vulnerabilities are addressed. Rather, it is important to have technical verification, have a vulnerability scanner go out and rescan to make sure that the vulnerability actually got addressed, and then have the system close the ticket. For those of you that might be interested in putting such a system in place, I'd recommend an open source project called Aegis, which I have a reference to in the book, that can help put that kind of system in place. That said, even if they had that kind of system in place, one other problem with the way that vulnerability management was being done at Equifax was that they were using an end-of-life vulnerability scanner from McAfee. And so for those of us that have been in software for a long time, we know that the second that a product is end of life, it's not going to get patched, it's not going to get maintained, there's not going to be more innovation going into it to identify the next set of best vulnerabilities in this case. The team at Equifax is well aware that that scanner was end of life. And what was happening is when the McAfee vulnerability scanner was going out and scanning Equifax's systems to try to identify the Apache Struts vulnerability, it was only looking in root directories of servers for the vulnerability. It was not looking in subdirectories of the server. And a particular Apache Struts vulnerability that existed on the relevant Equifax server was in a subdirectory. So the threat and vulnerability management team was doing scans, but didn't realize that they were blind, because their vulnerability scanner was falsely reporting that there was no vulnerabilities, when in fact there still were. In addition, once the attackers used the Apache Struts vulnerability to initially compromise a server, because of the fact that there was a fairly flat network within Equifax, the attackers were able to get visibility into approximately 60 databases, and they dropped 30 web shells into the Equifax environment, and compromised many of these databases in different ways as needed. In some cases, they were able to find unencrypted credentials for some of the databases in configuration files, and were able to exfiltrate data in that way. In other cases, they were able to take advantage of the fact that there was SQL injection vulnerabilities, and they would inject a JSP page to exploit the SQL injection vulnerability to exfiltrate more data. And so while the press kind of went on a blitz about the initial compromise vector with the Apache Struts vulnerability, there were a whole bunch of other things that went wrong that resulted in this breach. Just because there was an unpatched Apache Struts server didn't necessarily mean that there had to be a breach. There might have been an incident, there might have been an initial compromise, but had the right things been in place, there was still a lot of opportunity to have prevented this breach. So that's the Equifax breach. I'm going to talk about one Facebook breach. And by the way, over time, Facebook has had a lot of different hacks and breaches, which I've summarized in some of these slides. I think many folks may have heard about how Cambridge Analytica had abused Facebook's services and had taken advantage of data on 87 million profiles that were assembled by Cambridge Analytica, combing through, what a whole bunch of folks liked, and then use that data to advertise to voters in swing states in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. After that, Facebook had locked down the usage of their APIs so that you couldn't as easily have third-party developers scrape information about Facebook users. But one might ask the question that if you're a foreign nation state and you're still interested in that kind of profile data to target voters or do whatever you want with it, the question is, how do you get at that data even after Facebook's locked down their APIs? So I'm going to talk about the Facebook View As breach that occurred in 2018. So for many of you that have used Facebook, you know that there's this feature where you can view your profile as a member of the public. You know, when I look at my author page, for instance, on Facebook, which I really don't use too aggressively, but when you look at that, there's a whole bunch of editing capabilities and whatnot. And you can click on this button saying View as Visitor, and it'll then show you what your page looks like if you were a member of the public and didn't have all the capability to edit your profile. Well, in 2018, there was a pretty sophisticated breach that occurred in which the attackers used 3 software vulnerabilities in tandem to scrape tens of millions of Facebook profiles, even after their APIs have been locked down. So the first thing that went wrong, the first vulnerability, was that there was a box that allowed people to wish their friends happy birthday. Unfortunately, when you use the View As feature, it basically allowed people to post videos when it should not have let people post videos. So when people view your profile as just a member of the public, they were able to not only wish you a happy birthday, but they were able to post a video. The second thing that went wrong is that Facebook issued an update to their video uploader, which generated access tokens, effectively part of the cookie, that had full permissions of the Facebook mobile app. And then the third thing that went wrong, and this was the kicker, was that when the video uploader was used in this capacity, it generated an access token not for the person as a viewer, but for the person that was being looked up. So effectively, when you viewed somebody else's profile, you were able to get full read-write access to their profile instead of just being able to view it. So in any case, there's 3 vulnerabilities that came together for this breach. Facebook had identified that there was a whole bunch of more usage of their View As feature taking place, except it was taking place by an attacker. And when they investigated, they were then able to root cause that it was due to these 3 software vulnerabilities that the breach was able to occur. I think they initially issued password resets for about 90 million profiles, but upon investigation, they determined that it was, I think, 30 million profiles that were affected. But I thought this was pretty interesting, and at a level of sophistication that was kind of like well beyond, just one vulnerability or some phishing and some malware. Let's see, the very same year, Marriott also got breached. They acquired, Marriott's, of course, the largest hotel chain company in the world. They were in the process of acquiring Starwood Hotels. Starwood Hotels had actually been breached 4 years prior, but when Marriott was doing their due diligence to do their acquisition, they hadn't uncovered the fact that Starwood had been breached. And so the big lesson here, without getting all the details, is that if you're a big company and you're acquiring another company and the company that you acquire is breached, you're breached as well. So initially that company is a third party, but once you acquire them, they're a first party. And there was you can read the chapter for more details on this, but that was the big takeaway. Let's see, I'm just going to talk about 1 or 2 more breaches. I'm going to talk about the Capital One breach, and we'll go into a little bit more technical detail on this one. The Capital One breach, when it occurred in 2019, it was the largest cloud security breach of all time. To an extent, I think it still is the largest cloud security breach of all time. Capital One is, of course, a very large financial institution. They were probably the financial institution that most aggressively adopted cloud services and adopted Amazon's cloud services. And in 2019, what had happened is there was a single lone attacker, a former Amazon employee, who happened to have some technical skills, but didn't have any insider knowledge. And that attacker, who went by the code name of Erratic, was able to steal 100 million credit applications from Capital One's cloud systems. The way that the attack was identified was somebody had, Capital One didn't proactively detect it on their own. Somebody wrote into their vulnerability disclosure list saying, hey, there's a GitHub repository that looks like it has 100 million of your credit applications in it. You might want to check this out. So from the time that Capital One got that email, I mean, within 2 weeks, they looked at the GitLab repository. It happened to have Erratic's resume in the repository together with the stolen data. And so it was a pretty quick turnaround from them being notified to getting the authorities involved to arresting the attacker. The attacker got, $250,000 fine and 5 years in jail. But the breach costs for Capital One were estimated to exceed 100 million. And I think that there's been some regulatory fines already of 80 million, and the costs may still continue. The way it occurred was they had one of their EC2 virtual machine instances that had a server-side request forgery vulnerability, and there was a misconfiguration in one of their AWS buckets. Let me talk about the details. It could have been prevented through better firewall review or more automated cloud security scanning. Let me talk about how the breach happened. So this diagram shows on the left the attacker's machine. On the far right, there's Amazon's vulnerable virtual machine instances. It had a server-side request forgery vulnerability. And then the buckets, the simple storage service data buckets that had the 100 million credit card applications are shown in the middle here. There were a lot of cloud security breaches prior to this, where a whole bunch of organizations just simply left a bunch of data buckets public inadvertently. And so Booz Allen Hamilton and the Pentagon and a whole bunch of other organizations, there's a table of all the organizations that left buckets publicly exposed back in 2017. At least in this case, the buckets are private, but the attacker was able to get in as follows. The attacker was able to notice, because of the server-side request forgery vulnerability, the attacker was able to pose queries to the EC2 instance, which the EC2 instance would relay onto the metadata service. So virtual machines running in Amazon need to rely on this metadata service to get basic information about themselves, like what is my IP address, so I can communicate with other virtual machines. One of the other things that a virtual machine can do when it talks to the metadata service in Amazon, which is intended only to be used locally, you can ask, well, what security credentials do I have? And that in itself is not a bad thing, but the problem was that some software running on this vulnerable virtual machine instance effectively would be able to take queries from pretty much anybody on the internet. It would relay those queries onto the metadata service, and because of the server-side request forgery vulnerability, it would pass on and relay the response onto the third party. So this, in the field of computer science, is what we call the confused deputy. The metadata service is effectively a confused deputy because it's thinking that the software that's accessing, process that's asking the questions and getting responses is just and only this virtual machine instance, which is there for good reason and there to run Capital One services. But because of the fact that it could accept queries and URLs and then inadvertently relay the responses onto the attacker was able to pose queries to the metadata service that typically only the virtual machine instance should have been able to. And so after asking, hey, what security credentials do you have? The attacker was able to say, okay, please go ahead and actually give me the credentials. And the attacker would get the access IDs and secret keys for this web application firewall web role IAM account. And once the attacker had these legitimate credentials, she was able to locally catch them in our command line interface, and then pose queries to Capital One's data buckets, and just ask, hey, can you give me a list of all the different bucket names and folders that I can access? And because at this point, the attacker's coming in with legitimate credentials, the S3 buckets were not able to tell the difference between the illegitimate hacker and legitimate systems. And when the attacker then asked, hey, if you just go ahead and give me the data, the S3 bucket said, sure, here you go. So that's a very short summary, a little bit more technical than some of my previous explanations of how the Capital One breach occurred. There's of course more details in the chapter. But that was the largest cloud security breach of all time. Occurred in 2019. In 2020, when myself and my co-author were writing our book, we were waiting for what is going to be the big breach in 2020. And all of our publication deadlines were in October and November of 2020. And so we, there have been a couple insider attacks and attempted insider attacks that took place at Tesla and Twitter and Spotify, but nothing that was really big breach. And of course, in mid-December 2020, the SolarWinds attack was announced. FireEye had identified that attackers had broken into their systems and stolen some of their attack tools via a third-party software package made by a company called SolarWinds. SolarWinds actually has 300,000 customers out there. They have a product called Orion that is used to do IT performance monitoring. Attackers had broken into SolarWinds and modified their build pipeline so that the attackers could modify the version of the software that was being produced. They in particular injected just one file, and they, in a pretty sophisticated fashion, what they did was they even took care of race conditions and made sure that when SolarWinds was compiling their software, that when the compilation was occurring, they would grab a mutex on the appropriate file, inject their own, and then replace the original file so that the version of the software that got built was different than what SolarWinds might have expected. And then the attackers used that capability to issue a malicious code update to approximately 16 or 18,000 organizations, a number of which were government agencies. So attackers had broke into 9 government agencies, including the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. Commerce Department. The attackers had also gotten visibility into Microsoft source code because Microsoft was also a SolarWinds customer. And one of the things that I'll mention though is that in the SolarWinds hack, while what the attackers did when they broke in was sophisticated, I've had some conversations with the new CEO at SolarWinds, Sudhakar Ramakrishna. He's a great guy. He's been handling this breach in a very transparent way, and he's focused on, making things better. But they initially had about 16 hypotheses as to how the attackers initially got in, and they've limited that down to 3 last I heard. And those 3 are pretty much similar to the 5 or 6 technical root causes of breach that I've already mentioned. So we will be putting out a chapter on the SolarWinds hack since it occurred after our chapter deadlines. So if you're interested, go to bigbreaches.com, sign up, and you'll get that chapter. But that's a little bit about what happened. SolarWinds, this hack effectively sounded the alarm for third-party software vulnerabilities. In any case, I've talked about a lot of breaches. This year, there's also been an oil pipeline that was shut down for a week due to a ransomware attack. Some folks are ransomware is just a type of a malware. A lot of people are believing that now ransomware attacks are a matter of national security. I'd like to leave some time for questions. So I want to talk a little bit about roadmap to recovery. How do we get to a better state? And in the second half of the book, that's pretty much what we focus on. We start off with the first chapter in the second half of the book. We talk about 7 habits for highly effective security. And some of these, like habits 1 and 7, around being proactive, prepared, and paranoid, and number 7, embracing continuous improvement, kind of mirrors some of Stephen Covey's habits for personal success. But there's a number of other habits here that are super important, including building security and privacy in. And when we talk about that, we go back to early papers from Salter and Schroeder on the protection of computer information systems. And what we do is we illustrate some of the principles that they first talked about 50 years ago with some more modern day examples. I also believe it's important to put quantitative measures in place for security, in particular, measuring how effective your countermeasures are, scientifically effective your countermeasures are for the root causes of breach is extremely important. I'm sure an organization has hundreds of check boxes that they need to check to be compliant, but pretty much every major organization that's been breached has been compliant at the time of breach. So while compliance can help set in motion some impetus for good security hygiene, it is really important to focus on what are the root causes of breach and put in countermeasures that should be measured and automated as much as possible. So anyhow, I've just talked a little bit about some of these habits. And by the way, I do feel that for the major root causes of breach, so I mentioned earlier that you've got to have some managerial things going right. You've got to be prioritizing cybersecurity at a management level. You've got to be investing in cybersecurity appropriately, and you've got to be executing on cybersecurity initiatives. But beyond that, there's really just 5 or 6 technical root causes of breach, at this level of abstraction. And scientifically effective countermeasures exist for most of them. So for instance, if we're concerned about phishing and account takeover, which has come up in just breach after breach after breach, if you deploy hardware security keys like YubiKeys, or if you use the hardware security key functionality that exists in most iPhone and Android phones, basically you can nearly eliminate phishing from happening. So when Google, for instance, deployed YubiKeys back in 2017 to all their employees, even though they have regularly been under the threat and target of nation state attacks, there has not been one successful phishing account takeover that's worked against a Google employee. Salesforce has also deployed similar such defenses to a subset of their employees. The Department of Defense uses YubiKeys, but we could pretty much eliminate phishing if we start using hardware security keys across all organizations. So to an extent, I feel that we've got to adopt those defenses that have been shown to scientifically work and deploy them more aggressively. There's other areas like software security where you want to prevent both first-party and third-party software security vulnerabilities, where there's a whole bunch of technology, static analysis, dynamic analysis. There's nothing that's kind of foolproof, but there is a whole bunch of things that you can use to lower probability of breach due to a software security vulnerability. In any case, I don't have time to cover all of the different countermeasures here, but there's more in the book. And I would just encourage folks to primarily invest when they construct their security programs in addressing the root causes of breaches. Don't get too excited about what's the most recent buzz in the security marketplace or from a particular security vendor. Don't focus on just achieving compliance, assuming that achieving compliance will buy you security. Compliance should be achieved as a side effect. So in any case, I've gone through a myriad of breaches and the root causes and the lessons learned. I've talked about what I believe are the root causes based on data, and encourage an approach that focuses on addressing the root causes. I think there is a lot of room for continued innovation in our field. But I think that with many of the breaches that are taking place, they could pretty much be preventable and averted if you simply employ some of the better defenses that have been shown to be scientifically effective to date. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Neil. Certainly it is the case that those who don't learn from the past are going to be condemned to recapitulate it. So I think your book could probably be updated on a regular basis every 3 months for the indefinite future here.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll do one new chapter for every year and just cover the biggest breach of every year. And I think you're exactly right, Spaff. There's also another saying that you know, even though the future may be different from the past, it might rhyme. So
yeah. Well, I have a couple of questions now that have shown up, and one goes right to your conclusion. Many of these companies and organizations have mandated compliance testing and audit, such as PCI. How many of them actually met those requirements and still were breached?
they were all, to the best of my knowledge, compliant at the time of breach. So Target, for instance, was PCI compliant at the time of breach. They had been given an AOC. So I think one should not assume that one is secure just because you're compliant. Now, what happens, with some compliance organizations is that after a breach occurs, if the compliance organization wants their compliance certification to mean something, they can go in afterwards to say, oh, they couldn't possibly have been compliant, right? And they could find, oh, there's a whole bunch of things that were really wrong. But then why was a compliance certificate given, right? So I think compliance is very, very useful. It can encourage a whole bunch of good security hygiene, but compliance does not equal security. And I would encourage folks to focus actually on security and try to keep compliance as much as possible as a side effect.
That's great advice. We had one person wondering if the slides will be available in some way or not.
Yes, I can make the slides available. Absolutely.
Okay. I guess if you want to send us a PDF and anybody requests a copy, or we can link them in on the CERIAS page.
Sure.
So another question really here about auditing and compliance. If a third party caused a breach for someone, but they were audited and passed, then what's the benefit of that audit? How do we get audits that are really worthwhile?
So I think that it would be great for, so the typical challenge, and having been a chief information security officer myself, one of the challenges that you have is you have to be compliant, right? Otherwise you don't get to process the credit cards. Or you have to be compliant, say with HIPAA, otherwise you don't get to process patient information. So you have to be compliant, and you have 200 checkboxes that you need to check across a whole bunch of domains. But what I would encourage the compliance community to do is to look at what have been the root causes of the breaches, and perhaps prioritize the effectiveness of countermeasures for those root causes. So it's not just good enough to have some antivirus package running. Most of the malware that gets deployed these days is new malware variants, unknown malware, created to target a specific organization that doesn't match any previous signature. So if, for instance, you're using an anti-malware defense that only checks for known signatures and is, say, not leveraging some kind of AI algorithm to look for previously unknown threats, then chances are that anti-malware defense, while it might check a box, may not be sufficient. And so one thing we can do is iterate our compliance standards to take into account how the breaches have mostly been happening and prioritize the security controls and countermeasures that can prevent those things. And sure, there's a whole bunch of other things that should be done for good hygiene. And I think that's one way that we can raise the bar in the compliance field.
Great. Another question that's not directly about the breaches, perhaps, but what do you think about having greater penalties on those caught breaking in or misusing systems? Do you think that's going to discourage that kind of bad behavior?
So thus far, the Federal Trade Commission, the SEC, a number of different government organizations have been imposing increasing fines and numbers of fines. And that has been having some impact. I think a lot of boards are now taking cybersecurity more seriously simply because they could have a significant regulatory event. I think the largest such fine that I'm aware of is Facebook was fined $5 billion for privacy violations of their FTC consent decree back in 2019. $5 billion is a significant amount of money for most organizations, maybe not for Facebook, maybe it's a few weeks of their revenue. But I think one thing that perhaps we can take away is that it's either too early to tell whether the increasing amount of fines is having as much impact as we want it to, or fines in and of themselves of a company here and a company there, may not be sufficient. And so one question I wonder about is, does it make sense, for instance, I don't know, if ransomware is indeed a national security threat these days, should we be giving companies more tax credits to encourage further spending on cybersecurity? We're still in a world where, like you said, every 3 months there's some new big breach, and there have been years of fines getting imposed, more and increasing, but it's either probably too early to tell whether or not they're working, or maybe we should make the worst case assumption that it's not working and provide other incentives as well.
Yeah, there was a kind of a follow-up question here that you mentioned one CEO and one CISO were fired, but what about the breaches generally? Was it just limited to that, or were there other kinds of personnel penalties applied?
There have been other personnel penalties applied. So I think I talked specifically about the Target breach, but if we look at the Equifax breach, for instance, the CEO changed, the CISO changed, and that's been occurring in other breaches as well. So I don't have a kind of comprehensive list, but there is CEO and board level accountability for cybersecurity breaches to date. Okay. So in any case, I hope folks have found this material interesting. If you're interested in learning more, please come check out the Stanford Advanced Cybersecurity program, where we have all kinds of courses ranging from foundations of security to more significant ones. We also have courses for executives, and folks are welcome to drop me a note if there's more questions that I can't answer today.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We had a few questions we didn't get to, but those will have to wait for another time, or they can ask them of some of us offline. We really appreciate you coming back, and we try not to make it 14 more years before the next appearance. And for the audience in general, the recording of this will be online soon, and please be sure to tune in next week. Our speaker will be Win Schwartau. So thank you again, Neil, and I look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon.
Great, thank you, staff. Honor and privilege to present to your group here. Yes, let's re-engage, sooner than another 14 years. Looking forward to also potentially meeting in person at some point.
Okay, bye-bye then.
Thanks, bye.